My name's Ken Hoffman. I'm one of the original founders of the Northern Kentucky Civil War Roundtable. And our guest speaker tonight is Mr. Christopher Burns. Very happy to have him here. I have heard him speak before. It's very good. I think you're going to be in for a treat here. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to him, and we're very happy.
Great. Thank you, Ken. Thanks, Will, Dr. and Mrs. Ramage, and all of you who have come out tonight. Really looking forward to talking about a few things that are in all of our hearts. And tonight we're going to talk about something that took place right here. After 154 years, a single event that defined the valor and resolve of the people in this region has faded into the shadows of history. But the legacy can be found in the descendants, the names of our cities, and the few forts whose remnants remain. Tonight, we're going to return to the summer of 1862, when this region was under assault from an enemy whose goal was to pillage and burn the city, leaving only destruction in their wake. So a quick map. Most of you are very familiar with this, but I wanted to point out just Kentucky being a border state was obviously of interest to both the Union and the Confederates. So that's one of the reasons it made it so valuable, and one of the reasons that they attacked during this time. Cincinnati was one of the largest cities in America at the time, was the gateway to the West and a major manufacturing, pork exporter, and clothing manufacturer with just over 160,000 residents. The road and river network leading south to such cities as Louisville, Nashville, Atlanta, and Lexington made Cincinnati a commercial transportation center. Because of the trade and close proximity with the South, many of the residents and businesses were very sympathetic to the South. Cincinnati served as an art and educational center for northern and southern cities alike. And as one example, Miami University enrolled almost half of its students from the South during this time period. The Ohio River at the time was less than half of its current depth. And as you can see here, this is from 1860, the foundation of the suspension bridge on the Ohio side of the river. And over here you can see how far underwater it is. It was about 12 to 15 feet deep during the Civil War when it was at pool stage. And as you probably know, it's about 28 feet, or give and take a few feet, in pool stage currently. So because of that, it was fairly easy to cross, obviously except in times of flood. The hills surrounding Cincinnati in both Ohio and northern Kentucky were sparsely populated at the time, and only a few dirt roads, and most of those weren't very good. Northern Kentucky's population at the time was about 57,000, with the majority of them living in the river cities, mainly Covington and Newport. Here's a slide of the Newport Barracks, which played a part in this, as several troops were here at training when this event took place. It was constructed in 1803 and served as a training center with good rail and river access. During the war, it also served as a holding area for prisoners on their way to Johnson Island up in Lake Erie and other prison camps that were north of here. At the outbreak of the war in 1861, several fortifications were planned for northern Kentucky and Cincinnati to protect from any attack. The Army Corps of Engineers determined, after reviewing the existing fortifications early in '62, that these were woefully inadequate if there was any type of attack coming up from the south. That would change drastically as a result of the invasion of Kentucky. This is a picture of the battery in Mount Adams, overlooking what was called Fulton at the time, right here, which was a major manufacturing with steamboats. Over here you can see Bellevue and Dayton, and as you can see, it's all rural. There's very little of anything there except farmland. In 1862, the war was not going well for the Union. The Confederates were winning battles in the east and controlled most of Tennessee. In order to take the fight to the Yankees, Robert E. Lee planned a march into Maryland in order to take the fight out of the South and to the North. It resulted, of course, in the bloody Battle of Antietam on September 17th of that year, the bloodiest single day in American history. At the same time, General Braxton Bragg planned to march his army into Kentucky. So it was the only time during the Civil War where the Confederates attacked on northern, not southern soil, I should say, both in the east and the west. And Bragg attacked because he felt that he could take some of the people in Kentucky, the residents, and hopefully have them rise against the Union. Washington City, as capital, was known as it was known during the war, was extremely worried about Confederate attacks on northern cities, and with good reason. General Bragg was making plans in early August to attack Kentucky using a two-prong approach. And I know this isn't easy to see, but here we have Bragg and General Kirby Smith, and General Henry Heth served under Kirby Smith. So Bragg wanted to attack, as you can see, from two different sides here. He has Kirby Smith departing Knoxville on August the 14th, heading north into the Bluegrass, and he had his men leave August 28th from Chattanooga. And the point was to converge in the center and then make a decision on attacking Louisville or Cincinnati, and also to see if residents would rise up, that they believe would rise up. He would divide his forces with one arm under his command and another under Kirby Smith with 12,000 men into the heart of the Bluegrass country. He hoped to enlist the support of thousands of pro-Confederate residents who he believed would plan an uprising that would swell his ranks and hopefully send a Confederate government into Frankfort. That in turn would bring Kentucky, they hoped, into the Confederacy. That fear drove Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to announce the reformation of the Military Department of Ohio on August 19, 1862. The new department would encompass the old Northwest Territory of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin, as well as Kentucky east of the Tennessee River. Major General Horatio Wright was assigned to the command. On August 29th, General Kirby Smith and the Confederate forces marched over Cumberland Gap and were met with only a token resistance from the Union. They marched straight into Richmond, where they routed the Federals in one of the most lopsided battles of the war. The Union had 6,500 men, lost about 206 killed against a Confederate force of 6,800, and they only lost 78. From there, they attacked Lexington on September the 2nd and Frankfort on September 3rd, forcing the evacuation of the governor and other state officials. Once Paris fell, most of the Union troops in the region marched toward Louisville, leaving Cincinnati essentially very underdefended. The question that alarmed Washington, Cincinnati, and Louisville was where they would attack next. Kirby Smith's optimism was high. On September 3rd, he boasted to Bragg, 25,000 troops in a few days will be added to my command. On September 5th, he continued, Kentucky is rising in mass, a proud boast from a man who clearly did not understand Kentucky or her people. Cincinnati at the time was sparsely guarded by three companies of U.S. infantry, 400 residents at Newport Barracks, and several hundred recruits training at Camp Dennison about 15 miles northeast of the city. 2 Ohio regiments did end up retreating to Cincinnati from central Kentucky after Bragg attacked to assist in the defense of the Queen City. Even combined, that would be woefully short of the manpower needed if the Confederates attacked en masse. Ohio leaders in both Columbus and Cincinnati were extremely concerned, being reminded of rebel raider John Hunt Morgan's recent raid into Kentucky. Morgan created havoc by raiding Kentucky for several weeks in July. The disruption and the fear that it spread was another reason that led Bragg to attack the Bluegrass State. Morgan believed the attack would be a slam dunk for the Confederacy and result in thousands of new recruits. When the news of the Confederate advancement reached Ohio Governor David Todd, he issued a proclamation to the residents on September 2nd asking that each county to form themselves into companies and regiments to, quote, beat back the enemy at all points he may attempt to invade our state. He notified General Wright, alerting him of his call to troops. He told Wright to be prepared for thousands of volunteers, and thousands came from almost every county in the state, as well as from Kentucky and Indiana. There's a slide of the Union commanders that were involved in this. The siege of Cincinnati, Horatio Wright will eventually work with General Lew Wallace, and Ormsby Mitchell we'll talk about in just a few minutes. General Wright was concerned because he lacked enough seasoned troops to counter the Confederate threat. Many troops that were available were untried in combat, and a furious correspondence with the governors of Ohio, Kentucky, and Michigan ensued. The governors agreed to the request, but they were struggling to raise new regiments because of a shortage of equipment and arms for the recruits. Graduating second in his class at West Point in 1841, General Wright had proven himself an extremely capable engineer. But by August of '62, there were questions about his field command abilities. He had served in South Carolina in operations against Port Royal and Hilton Head Island, and he led a division in a disaster attack at Charleston, South Carolina. His standing in the crisis of Kentucky, however, would change his image and his luck. William Howard Neff was a noted Cincinnati businessman, and he was concerned, like everybody else, for the safety of the people and the many assets that would be destroyed if the Confederates attacked. He surmised that if the rebels took possession of the city for 24 hours, it would enable them to attack and ransack army stores, steal money from the banks, and destroy the city by fire. But worst of all, he said the moral effect would have been extremely inspiring to the Confederate and the opposite for the Union. When he heard about Bragg's troops moving north, Neff buried his silver, hid his valuables, sent his money from his banks to New York, and sent his family to Yellow Springs, Ohio for safety. Many others followed suit as the fear spread like wildfire through the city and the entire region. Neff had volunteered earlier in the war with his military company that served 90 days. The same company volunteered again and named their regiment the Pearl Street Rifles. They knew from experience what to expect, and that was the exception during the next 3 weeks. On September 1st, General Wright, who had proceeded to Lexington, ordered General Lew Wallace to remain in Cincinnati and take command of the troops arriving in the Queen City. Wright knew General Wallace had experience in the Mexican War, as well as the battles of Fort Henry, Donaldson, and of course Shiloh. He quickly turned to Wallace for support in the emergency. And to the benefit of the entire operation, Wallace would remain in charge until the crisis was over. Wallace issued a proclamation to the citizens of Cincinnati stating, quote, "The undersigned by order of Major General H.G. Wright assumes command of Cincinnati, Covington, and Newport. It is fair to inform the citizens that an active, daring, and powerful enemy threatens them with every consequence of war. Yet these cities must be defended, and their inhabitants must assist in the preparation to ensure that the attack is unsuccessful. Patriotism, duty, honor, and self-preservation was the call for him. And he said it must be done equally by all classes. So it mattered not to him whether you were rich or poor, Irish, German, black, or some other descendant. He expected you to do your part. And he put out an order stating, quote, "Soldiers for battle, citizens for labor." General Wright suspended business in the city and ordered that all citizens should assemble in government public places and be ready to carry out the orders. The mayor of Cincinnati, George Hatch, followed suit, further noting in a bulletin that all persons organize themselves in a manner deemed best for the defense of the city. In its lead editorial, the Cincinnati Gazette declared, "To arms, to arms! The time for playing war has passed. The enemy is fast approaching our city. Kentucky has already been invaded, and our cities for the first time since the rebellion are seriously threatened. Let us prepare to resist an army 100,000 strong bent on our destruction." Back in November of '61, General Ormsby Mitchell and Colonel Charles Whittlesley of the Engineering Corps oversaw construction of 8 batteries and 1 fort in northern Kentucky. Not only did Mitchell have military experience, but he was also a noted professor of astronomy at the University of Cincinnati. He completed the main fort along the Lexington Pike, today Dixie Highway, I'm sure many of you know, just south of the Kyles Interchange on the west side of Dixie Highway. And that became known, of course, as Fort Mitchell. It was the largest and best defended fort in the region since it guarded the main road from Lexington to Cincinnati. On September 4th, 1862, Wallace met with Wright and they devised a plan that would complete and upgrade the series of forts and batteries with artillery, and more important, link those forts constructed along the hills in Campbell and Kenton County. Using volunteers, they planned to build the batteries in a line of trenches that would protect the city from any attack from the south. And I know these aren't easy to see from these maps, but there's a book at the back of the room that one of your members was so gracious to bring that can show you. And basically the fort started in Bromley, as you can see right up here, and followed essentially Spooky Hollow Road through DeVue Park, came close to the intersection of I-75 and Kyles Lane, then followed that hill ridge down where Battery Hooper, where the James Ramage Museum is currently located, Battery Carlisle, and on down, and finally comes parallel here with Route 17 as it turns northeast in Latonia. And this is Fort Mitchell right here. This slide shows a depiction today of what this would look like. Here's I-75. This is Battery Hooper, where the Ramage Museum exists. And down this ridge here, you can see where Route 17 in Latonia goes. And those batteries in the trenches essentially follow that line just north of Route 17. And the pontoon bridge they built is right at the entrance of Mikan Park. Goes right across south of where the bridge, I-275 bridge is now. These are the Campbell County. The pontoon bridge comes across here. So it wasn't as, as focused as here because you had several hills and batteries up on top of several. Battery Wiggins, which I have a picture we'll see later, basically controlled the Licking River. But Battery Schaller, all these went up the hill into Southgate and eventually into the Highlands, which of course now is Fort Thomas. The batteries and forts were named after military personnel as well as noted people from the region. This would be the first line of defense. The second line would be the Ohio River. And to protect that, General Wright ordered 16 steamboats to be armed with cannons that would patrol the river day and night as long as a Confederate threat seemed imminent. The final defense came from artillery on Mount Adams, as we saw earlier, Price Hill, and at the foot of the huge foundation of the unfinished suspension bridge. Responding to the call to arms were 12,000 militia and about 60,000 volunteers. They would later become known as the Squirrel Hunters, so named by Cincinnati paymaster Malcolm McDowell. One author reported that the famed Squirrel Hunters, in their homespun clothing, carrying their antiquated squirrel guns, poured forth from the farms and woods to help construct and occupy the trenches. Many of them had no military training at all, but their enthusiasm and support greatly aided the federal efforts during the scare. This is from Frank Leslie's Weekly. These are the squirrel hunters entertained by the people in the Fifth Street Market, which we'll talk about in a minute. You can see the ladies here all dressed with fruit and different things in their baskets. The men marching down Vine Street towards the river. So you can see how many people turned out for this. On September 6th, Wallace reviewed the troops as they marched down Vine Street, and Neff later remembered that so many trains were transporting volunteers to the city that it resembled a military camp. Police were used as provost guards and put on every corner to ensure that all able-bodied men were assisting. Only artists were allowed to remain in town so they could provide entertainment at night. As an incentive, the citizens of Cincinnati and the surrounding community sought donations to pay the volunteers between $1 and $1.50 a day for their work. Between September 3rd and 8th, an average of almost 1,800 volunteers signed up each day, and that number increased the following weeks. Records show that civilians from 65 counties in Ohio of 83, numbering 15,600 men, reported for duty. That number, however, is considerably less than the actual number that volunteered because many of the men never registered. A major issue was lack of basics that the troops needed, including uniforms, arms, tents, and other supplies. Those without guns had to wait until they arrived. A few units without tents, including the Pearl Street Rifles, asked local residents for blankets, and they gladly donated them for the cause. Such was the universal generosity of most citizens, who worked in many different capacities during the siege. To assist in the preparations, local women made valuable contributions as well. Some sewed bandages and tourniquets, while others baked and served meals. Still others waited tables every day and night at the Fifth Street Market, which the city had commandeered as a central commissary and gathering place for the troops and the volunteers, which you see on this picture here. To help ensure safety, especially with the untrained squirrel hunters, the sale of alcohol was banned for 7 days in early September. The Cincinnati Gazette reported that, quote, wholesale liquor trade is prohibited in the city except of supporting druggists. Merchants are allowed to ship to points no less than 30 miles from the city. The siege also adversely affected business as well. Events reported in the Cincinnati Gazette stated, with business being suspended, the volume of commerce has been exceedingly slender. The city, under martial law, too, deters country people to a very large extent from visiting us. The occupation of the Fifth Street Market, in another story by the military authorities, still prevents the resumption of business in that place. The usual market yesterday was consequently held at 6th Street, and the prices of meats are much higher, while the fish market is also very low. General Wallace, meanwhile, was distressed at the length of time that it took to ferry troops across the river. And here you can see another Leslie's of the troops gathering. You can see the long lines here on the Ohio side getting ready to transport the troops over to Covington. You can imagine how long that would have taken for thousands of militia and volunteers together. There obviously was no completed bridge at the time, so the boats had to do all the transporting. Wallace consulted with Cincinnati architect Wesley Cameron regarding the feasibility of building a pontoon bridge across the Ohio. Cameron agreed and soon constructed a bridge made of empty coal barges lashed side by side, and incredibly, it was finished in only 30 hours. And here's a picture depicting General Wright at the front, leading supposedly all the troops coming across the Ohio into Covington. But as you can see, it would take a lot less time to do that than to continue to ferry the troops. Neff remembered proudly as the Pearl Street Rifles headed to the river. As we marched down Vine Street, he said, we heard deafening cheers and hurrahs with ladies waving handkerchiefs. Once we crossed the river, we got a very different reception. The sidewalks in Covington were lined with rebel sympathizers who jeered and hooted as we passed. We were ordered to say nothing in return but continue marching and complete our task, and that's what we did. The Cincinnati Gazette printed, never before in the history did Cincinnati present so inspiring a sight as yesterday. From all quarters of the compass they came on horseback and on foot, with squirrel rifles, shotguns, and bayoneted muskets. It demonstrated our people will never surrender the Union. The police, most of whom were segregationists at that time, decided to round up all blacks living in the city. They feared what could happen if the Confederates made it across the river, so they took them from their homes, some at Bayonet Point, and forced them into a mule pen on Plum Street. To his credit, General Wright quickly corrected this injustice, and on September 4th, he commissioned Judge William Dixon as commander of the colored troops. Dixon was a family friend of Abraham Lincoln, with his wife being a cousin of Mary Todd Lincoln. He would treat the blacks as men and quickly form the 700-man unit into the famous Black Brigade. This is Judge William Dixon and Lew Wallace on a plaque that's down in Smale Park, down at the riverfront, with several other plaques that you can see down there that talked about the Black Brigade. Ironically, once Neff's regiment settled in northern Kentucky, he said they saw the Black Brigade assemble behind them. They halted the brigade to inquire if they had any experience as cooks. Several of them raised their hands and said yes. Neff said soon about 100 of them, quote, found a new vocation they much preferred to digging. Here's another one of the plaques of the Black Brigade marching downtown. You can see, here's Judge Dixon here, one of the people with the flag, these little kids, and they're carrying shovels and pickaxes, and you can see behind them the people cheering. The majority of the Black Brigade labored on earthwork fortifications and military roads for more than 2 weeks. This was one of the first times that the Union Army utilized the service of African Americans to assist in the Union cause. Their commanders and Army engineers recognized their efficiency. Their main role, along with many in the units involved, consisted of constructing military roads, digging trenches and rifle pits, felling forest, and building forts. During their first week of service, they received no compensation for their labor. The second week, most were paid $1 a day. By the third week, they were paid $1.50. On September 20th, after 15 days, they completed their work, which included the fortifications near Southgate, Kentucky. And there's the flag that was made for them that still exists. Judge Dixon addressed the men afterwards, saying, quote, "You have labored faithfully. The hills across yonder river will be a perpetual monument of your labors. Go to your homes with the consciousness of having performed your duty, of deserving the protection of the law, and bearing with you the gratitude and respect of all honorable men." He said they were the best workers he had ever seen. They even made national news when the New York Times recorded on September 18th that they were, quote, throwing up earthworks with marvelous celerity. This is the famous Burnett House, where many presidents and other noted people who came to Cincinnati during the middle and latter part of the 19th century stayed. Reporters from many cities flocked to Cincinnati, hoping for a dramatic story. Many of them stayed right here. This was on the corner of 3rd and Vine. Typical of the stories that came out at the time were the following. This was followed by a reporter who was on the top floor. "From the security of my hotel room high in the Burnett House, I have a full view of the battle area. I can observe battle zones in the Kentucky hills right before me. And the atmosphere is intense. The Ohio River has been spanned, over which pass day and night Union forces and volunteers from many northern sections of the Union. The Kentucky hills of Kenton and Campbell counties are bristling with cannon fortifications and rifle pits, awaiting an enemy which is reported to be but 20 miles south. Federal pickets report encounters with the rebel scouts were probing for weaknesses in the lines of defense. General Wallace has directed his officers to caution the defenders to stay behind your breastworks and they'll never get through. This is a slide of the Fort Mitchell, the only four-sided fort that was actually built during the time. You can see cannon. I know it's not easy to see in several places as it faces south along the Lexington Pike. And that again was a key to the defense. Situated on present-day Dixie Highway, it protected the approaches of the Confederates where the Union expected them to march north from Lexington. The surrounding area, as you can see in 1862, was nothing more than a few houses situated among a few of the wooded ravines. Here's a picture taken earlier this year by Andreas, who is taping this for me tonight. We were there in March, Battery Hooper, where the Ramage Museum is, and none of this was here in 1862. All these hills would have been completely cleared, but what you can see clearly is what an angle you have with artillery up on that hillside. So this is the I-275 bridge over the Licking River, which you can see part of right here, and all the stores and everything down on Route 17 down here. So you can see why they chose that site, and many of the sites, if they didn't have woods and trees, of course, were in this. Yes?
Chris, a gun there would fire how far?
Well, the ones that I've seen different distances on that. I would defer to Dr. Ramage to answer that one.
Over a mile, but they didn't have any cannon at Battery Hooper during this crisis. It was just men with rifles.
Did they put them in later?
Yes, yes. They were well armed with cannon, a couple of 18-pounders by 1864. So they went on arming it after this. There were 15 cannon, most of them in Fort Mitchell for the crisis, but none at Battery Hooper. But the rifle pits extended on down to the river, so the area was covered by rifles.
And other forts had the roads covered as well.
Batteries, yes.
Batteries, yes. Thank you. This is Battery Wiggins on the Licking River. It's where the current Frederick's Landing Park is in Wilder. So it was somewhere in this vicinity. And it covered, again, as I discussed earlier, the part of the Licking River and any approaches from that, the lower parts of Campbell County. By September 6th, more military support was on the way as Union Generals George Crook and A.J. Smith were ordered to the department to help bring seasoned officers to the area. Meanwhile, Wright had everyone involved. About 55,000 men aided in felling trees, digging trenches, and eventually were placed behind the rifle pits. Another 15,000 were deployed in batteries and fordable places above and below Cincinnati along the Ohio River. The efforts of the local citizenry eventually built a defensive line that would repel anything but a powerful seasoned force approaching from the south. Here's another Leslie's drawing you can see of the men building the trenches. Not sure where this was, but you can see the wheelbarrows here. They're moving dirt down the ravine as well as felling the trees. They have pickaxes and shovels, and the men on horses leading them. So at least it gives us a good idea of the kind of work that would have been done on those trenches. And it was very hot during that September then, so it would not have been fun work. Strangely enough, women and children were permitted to tour the lines and many of them brought food and drinks and made it truly a family affair for several enjoyable days during that fall. This ended, however, ironically on September 11th due to the approaching Confederates. General-in-Chief of the Army Henry Halleck was extremely concerned about the safety of both Cincinnati and Louisville. Halleck even received a demand from Kentucky Governor James Robinson, depicted here. Robinson was an interesting character. He was a moderate and a Henry Clay man, so he was against secession, but also abolition. He was against fugitive slave law, but also emancipation. So went politics in Kentucky at that time. But during this time, he wrote to Lincoln protesting, quote, against the withdrawal of enemy forces from Cincinnati. He said there were defenses at Cincinnati, natural and artificial, also in ample force, and there are none here close to Louisville and none ordered. Please communicate with the commanding general of this department in regard to this matter. Frustrated, General Wright was beside himself, trying to placate both the governor of Kentucky and Washington, an impossible feat even on the best day. Meanwhile, from the Confederate side, on September 6, General Kirby Smith was situated at Lexington and Frankfort. At that time, General Bragg and Union General John Carlos Buell were soon racing desperately for Louisville. Cautiously, the Confederates decided to press a limited number of their forces northward. General Kirby Smith split his 12,000 men and ordered General Heth to march north from Georgetown toward Cincinnati with approximately 4 brigades or about 8,000 troops. Confederate infantry were fanning out to take both Falmouth and Williamstown on their way north. Local residents were fearful for the land and any valuables. The attack led farmers to drive their livestock and other valuables north toward the Ohio River. Once he reached Walton, General Heth went into camp. From there, he dispatched several scouts in reconnaissance to determine the strength of the Cincinnati defenses. The scouts told him that local residents claimed those manning the trenches would, quote, flee at the first sign of attack. This gave hope to Bragg and Smith. In fact, Bragg brought as many as 20,000 additional rifles with which to equip the residents who he assumed would rise up against the Yankees. Various rumors from frightened citizens reported that as many as 60,000 soldiers were on the road marching north toward the Queen City. But Wright knew that reports both from the military and civilian sources throughout the war overestimated the number they were really facing. But he clearly understood the threat. Heth marched as far as Fort Mitchell and camped. The morning of September 11th, he sent out a reconnaissance party to probe the new defenses for any weakness. Several skirmishes followed that day and resulted in a few casualties. Confederate cavalry reached as far as Banklick Road in the morning and Latonia Springs that afternoon. Late that same day, Bragg ordered Smith to be ready for a possible attack on Louisville. In order to prepare, Smith recalled Heth, which in turn created a controversy that lasted a lifetime. Ordering Heth south effectively ended the Confederate crisis in northern Kentucky and Cincinnati. Kentucky remained a slave state, as we know, but true to the spirit of their hero Henry Clay, the majority also remained loyal to the Union, and the expected uprising of new recruits never materialized. Bragg himself noted that, quote, when it came time to step forward, it seemed the residents of the area were more concerned with their fat pigs and their fertile fields than the cause of the Confederacy. A Union captain commanding a company of scouts reported the rear guard of the rebels by the afternoon to be 4 miles south of Florence. He noted that the roads were strewn with guns, knapsacks, camping equipment, and other supplies. Neff said on the morning of September 12th the Pearl Street Rifles were awakened by a chorus of inspiring words from the song John Brown's Body. It started faintly, he said, but it got louder as those near to him joined in. He said, slowly, regiment after regiment were caught up in the strain. The song reverberated from the hill and the valley. There was nothing more inspirational or beautiful, he said, an occasion which comes but once in a lifetime, never to be forgotten. Afterward, General Wallace rode up and said, the skedaddle is complete. Every sign of a rout. The danger is over. We will leave troops enough to man the forts, and tomorrow you can return to the city. Finally, after concentrating their efforts against a rebel attack, the squirrel hunters and troops that had come from all walks of life ended the 3-week ordeal with a triumphant march home. And here's a picture depicting the triumphant march. As you can see, the band playing and the troops marching up Vine Street from the river. The volunteers had left their homes and concentrated their efforts as a single force in a defining event that eventually saved the city. Back home, it would come to define them and provide stories for their children and grandchildren. General Wallace declared, when the history of Cincinnati during the past 2 weeks comes to be written up, it will be said it was the spades and not the guns that saved the city from attack from the rebels. No real pursuit was ever ordered, as most of the military forces were sent by steamboat to Louisville to prevent capture from General Bragg. However, small scouting forces were sent south to harass the rear guard of Heath's forces. Skirmishes occurred at Florence on September 17th, where 57 Union cavalry engaged 101 Confederates that left 6 dead and 8 wounded. Another skirmish about 2 weeks later, led by Confederate Colonel Basil Duke, who of course rode with Morgan, attacked with 500 men near Snow's Pond in Boone County. Few casualties resulted from that as well. As recognition of their sweat and determination, in 1908, the Ohio General Assembly passed a resolution to award each squirrel hunter $13. That was equal to 1 month's pay for an Ohio militiaman in 1842. And here's a slide of the discharge paper that they talked the state into making. This is the famous Malcolm McDowell who named the squirrel hunters. There's one of the squirrel hunters loading his rifle to shoot the squirrel here. You see the governor, and so it was a pretty neat ordeal for those guys, I guess, to get something like that they could keep and pass down through the years. The Confederacy's only major invasion of Kentucky was to continue for almost another month. Finally, on October 8th, near a small crossroads named Perryville, the armies of Buell and Bragg finally stumbled into each other and initiated, of course, the bloodiest battle in Kentucky. Tactically, the Confederates got the better of their northern counterparts, but General Bragg, realizing he was facing a numerically superior foe, determined it was time to retreat. In the end, Smith and Bragg had miscalculated. Kentucky had not risen in mass to join the Confederate liberators. Heth made light of the Union defense later on. The initial skirmishing near Florence convinced him that the Federal forces in his front were nothing more than militia. He claimed his troops were formed in a line of battle, ready to sweep all opposition aside and march across the Ohio. Then a dispatch came from Kirby Smith, quote, positively ordering that no attack be made. After the war, during a meeting in Cincinnati, Smith and Wallace argued the point publicly, but neither would be persuaded from their view. Heth was a strong supporter of Kirby Smith, and he blamed the failure of the Kentucky campaign on Braxton Bragg. Upon reaching Richmond, Virginia, after it was over, Heth met with Confederate President Jefferson Davis and told him of Bragg's reputed incompetence. He said, quote, there is no man in either of the contending armies who was General Bragg's superior as an organizer or as a disciplinarian. But when he was in the presence of an enemy, he lost his head. A poem honoring General Wallace captured the moment of the hero despite its amateur prose, and I'm just going to read 3 lines of it. The Siege of Cincinnati. Who saved our city when the foe swore in his wrath to lay it low and turn to joy our tears of woe? Lew Wallace. Who taught us how to cock the gun and aim it straight and never run and made us heroes every one? Lew Wallace. Who sat his prancing steed astraddle upon a silver-mounted saddle and saw the enemy ski-daddle? Lew Wallace. Thank you for your time.